The railways transformed Britain. From town to town and city to city, the tracks spread. They changed the way we live forever. But there was a darker side to the advent of the railways. This technological revolution offered new opportunities for the oldest of crimes. In this series, we'll be investigating the most notorious murders ever to take place on the British railways. Stories of the men who killed, of the police who hunted them, and of the victims who were left behind. From the files of Scotland Yard and the railway police, this is the history of blood on the tracks of Britain. The 9th of July, 1864. It was 10:10 in the evening and a train was readying for departure from Hackney Station in East London. Two bank clerks with first-class tickets had just taken seats in the compartment nearest the engine. But as the young men sat down, they realized something was very wrong. The cushions and walls were splattered with blood. A black leather bag lay open on a seat. On the floor was a man's cane topped with a heavy ivory knob. And beside it, a crumpled top hat. Whatever had happened in that first-class compartment had been violent, but no one had heard any cries for help and there was no report of a disturbance. The victim and his attacker had vanished.
It caused quite a shock. It was a big sensation at the time. It did put into people's minds doubts about the safety of the railways.
It disturbs the complacency that had surrounded railway travel in a way that leads us to think a great deal about the impact of technology and assumptions about how positive it is.
It showed that this new way of travelling was not necessarily safe. You could be stuck in a sealed compartment and come to a very sticky end.
The railways were the technological icon of the 19th century. The first public railway powered by steam opened in 1830. It linked the industrial powerhouse of Manchester with the port at Liverpool, and it was intended to carry mostly freight. But passenger demand quickly exceeded all expectations. Until then, a stagecoach had been the fastest form of public transport. It could cover 8 miles in an hour. The Liverpool and Manchester railway trains could cover 17 miles in an hour. And they were not only twice as fast as a stagecoach, the tickets were half the price. The new railway was hugely popular and profitable. Investors and businessmen quickly saw the potential. Britain was seized by a railway mania. New lines stretched out across the country.
It was probably the most momentous innovation since the invention of agriculture at the end of the Stone Age.
Lots of different railway companies, privately financed by and large, and not always particularly well coordinated. They would choose a route which they thought was going to give them most commercial advantage.
There were a number of minor rail companies, but these gradually became amalgamated until sort of by the 1860s, you had something like about 5,000 miles of track.
The pace of change was staggering. By 1864, nearly every major town and city in Britain was linked by a sprawling network of railway tracks. These iron roads sliced through hills and forests. They spanned rivers and valleys. They were even beginning to burrow beneath the earth.
It transformed not just the scenery, but the culture as well. Everything seemed like it was going to take place at high speed, and people's sense of time became standardized.
Trains had to keep railway time, so you, the passengers, the users of the railway, you had to keep railway time too.
It transformed people's sense of space, the whole world seeming much more connected in a way that we can compare to the internet today. If you were born at the end of this revolution, it would have been hard to imagine what it was like to live without the railway.
Passengers flocked to the railways in their thousands. The working population of Britain was on the move as never before. But alongside that excitement, this technological innovation also provoked fears. Could the human body cope with such speeds? Would society, with all its traditional bonds and hierarchies, survive this steam-powered revolution?
Victorian society was highly stratified. The class system was just embedded into everything. There were worries with the railways that there would be a sort of rather social promiscuity, the mixing. You know, the baronet might have to sit next to a baker or a boot blackener or a butcher.
People were confined to individual compartments, so people weren't quite sure who was going to get on at the next station and share a compartment with them.
It worried the Victorians that there were these opportunities for the criminal classes, the roughs, to have an easier access to the respectable middle and upper classes, to respectable women, to make themselves nuisances in a way that, if they were simply on foot, they couldn't do.
So people frequently hid their bags or gripped their stick, ready to beat off an attack. So there was this fear, this uncertainty about travelling in a railway carriage.
Such things didn't worry Mr. Thomas Briggs. In 1864, the 69-year-old banker had an annual season ticket for the North London Railway.
The North London Railway did not run third-class carriages in 1864. Because it served the city, Fenchurch Street, through to the newly expanding middle-class suburbs, Hackney, Chalk Farm, the idea was that it would pass through the working class areas, but not stop in them. So they only provided carriages for second class and first class passengers.
Thomas Briggs was a very well-to-do and quite sort of wealthy man, actually. He was the chief cashier at a bank in the city.
This is a gentleman who has really pretty much got to the upper echelons of the middle classes. You couldn't go higher than he had risen without becoming a partner.
Briggs took the train almost every day, journeying between his home in Hackney and his office at Robarts Curtis Bank in the city. The 9th of July was no different. It was a Saturday, but Briggs was still expected at the office. At 3 p.m. after work, He took an omnibus across London Bridge to pay one of his regular visits to his niece in Peckham. He had dinner with Caroline and her husband, and it was still light when he left at around 8:30. He reached Fenchurch Street Station in time for the 9:45 train. He cheerfully bid the ticket collector good night, then with his cane and his black leather bag in hand, Thomas Briggs clambered into the first-class compartment nearest the engine. A few minutes later, the train was on the move. The empty and bloodied first-class compartment found at Hackney Station was sealed off. Then the train departed just a few minutes late. Police would soon meet it at Chalk Farm, its final stop. By then, another grim discovery had been made. An empty train was returning to Bow Station when its driver spotted something between the tracks. He stopped his engine and sent the stoker and guard out to investigate. And lying on the gravel was the twisted, black-clad body of a man. Thomas Briggs was unconscious, but still alive.
The train driver and the conductor called for help from a nearby pub, and men came out onto the track to help him, and a police officer came from K Division, which was Stepney at the time, and the Metropolitan Police. And they took him to the pub, looked after him, and called the doctor to him.
His head was terribly injured from him either falling, jumping, or being pushed out of the railway carriage at some speed. He also had abrasions and bruises on his hands and his lower arms, which suggest that he had been fighting at least one assailant.
When the doctors looked at the injuries, they thought that one of the head injuries might have been from when he fell onto the tracks, but also they realised that other injuries were caused by a blunt instrument and he had been assaulted.
His wounds were severe. His skull had been caved in. A deep, jagged cut almost sliced his ear clean off. His white beard was stained scarlet with blood. Briggs was identified from letters found in his coat pocket. They carried him first to a nearby pub, and then to his home, a fine Regency townhouse in a Hackney Garden Square. And there, late on the 10th of July, Thomas Briggs died. The Monday papers were full of news of the attack. Briggs had been a gentleman, chief clerk at the Robarts Curtis Bank, the embodiment of Victorian middle-class affluence and respectability. And he had been murdered while a passenger on the great technological innovation of the age.
It was a complete threat to sort of established norms. This was the first time that somebody had been murdered in a railway train.
A train like that should have been secure. It should have been a safe environment. That it should have happened in a first-class carriage was particularly shocking.
It gave the sense, if you could be slaughtered in a train carriage, then why not in a church pew, or why not at your workplace?
It attacked the guardians of the respectability that made Britain and the British Empire great.
Scotland Yard Police Commissioner Sir Richard Mayne appointed one of his best men to the investigation. Detective Inspector Richard Tanner was just 31 years old and newly promoted, but he was well respected for his hard work and keen eye for the crucial lead. The family of Thomas Briggs had identified the cane and the black leather bag found in the compartment. They had belonged to the slain man. But the hat? Briggs wore a silk top hat made by expert craftsmen in the City of London. His family didn't recognize the crumpled beaver hat at all.
It's an almost sort of Cluedo-like touch, you know, the crumpled hat in the train compartment.
It was not a hat that a man of Mr. Briggs's status, responsibility, his standing would have dreamt of wearing.
Thomas Briggs bought his hats at a guinea a time from a hatter in the City of London. They were silk top hats. This was different.
This beaver hat that was found was only about 8 and sixpence or 10 and sixpence in actually price. It was a much cheaper hat than Mr. Briggs's normal hat.
Find the owner of the crumpled top hat, and Inspector Tanner would find the killer. He soon got an early breakthrough. Thomas Briggs had owned a heavy, old-fashioned watch with a gold case and chain, but it was missing after the attack. A description of it was circulated to the newspapers, where it was seen by jeweller John Death. Death claimed a gold chain, like the one belonging to Thomas Briggs, had been exchanged in his shop on the Monday after the murder. The customer had been a young, clean-shaven man with a foreign accent. He had picked out a cheaper, more modern chain, as well as a signet ring. Death had packed the chain in a small cardboard box, stamped with his shop's address.
John Death had never seen the young man before, and he described him as about 30. He thought he was German, and he noticed that all the time that he was sort of valuing the chain, the young man was sort of turning this way and that, so as to stop a really clear impression being taken of him.
They would have been used to somebody being slightly embarrassed by the need to undertake such a transaction. So for him to remain in the shadows would not have been difficult and not automatically suspect. But it's an unusual enough transaction to account for Death's remembering him. For him to have chosen to exchange the watch chain for something that was inferior, the gap was not enough. It's a 5-shilling gap between the cost of the chain that he chose in exchange. If it had been £1, £2, that would have been understandable and probably forgotten. But it's strange.
The police took away the heavy, old-fashioned chain as evidence. It was quickly identified as belonging to Thomas Briggs. Inspector Tanner now had a possible suspect, but he had no name and only the vaguest of descriptions. He needed more. Thomas Briggs' employers at the Robarts Curtis Bank put up £100 as a reward for information. The government matched it, as did the North London Railway Company. Posters were plastered across the capital. But days passed with no further breakthrough. Tanner knew with each day that passed, the crime was less likely to be solved. His investigation was in trouble.
They had failed to come up with a solution to a murder that had caused national, not just local, panic. The newspapers were demanding to know why the detective police were so failing to solve this crime.
London was a multicultural city. It had always embraced immigrants. The presence of a German wasn't in and of itself particularly strange. It certainly wouldn't have flagged up, oh, he's probably a murderer, what on earth was a German doing?
It left the police still looking for a needle in a haystack.
By the 18th of July, almost 10 days had passed since the murder of Thomas Briggs. The victim had been buried, but the case was far from solved. Then, at 11:15 that evening, a man walked into a police station in Marylebone and reignited the hunt for the killer. Jonathan Matthews was a Hackney carriage driver. He told police that on the Monday after the murder, a young German friend had paid him a call. His name was Franz Müller. He was 23, a tailor, who was particularly fond of his black beaver hat. As they spoke, Müller had given Matthew's daughter a box to play with, and printed on the lid was the name and address of the jeweller, John Death.
This was the big breakthrough.
The police, who were under huge pressure to come up with a solution, have something.
Yes, the box had come from the jeweller's shop. Yes, the chain and the ring had been placed in the box. But best of all, Matthews was even able to provide a photograph. This really opened up the case now.
Tanner had his lead at last. There was just one problem. The reason Franz Müller had visited Jonathan Matthews. He'd come to say goodbye before leaving for America. In 1864, the Grinnell and Company shipping line offered some of the cheapest fares to America, and it wasn't hard to see why. The Victoria was an old-fashioned sailing ship. Steerage passengers paid just £4 to cross the Atlantic, but their quarters were cramped and uncomfortable. They had to prepare their own meals, and the passage would take 19 days, if they were lucky. Among the passengers enjoying the Victoria's meagre comforts in July 1864 was a young tailor. He was leaving his troubles behind, he thought, heading for a new start in the new world.
We know that he comes from Thuringia in Germany, and that relatively few people from that region, and indeed from his background, came to the UK.
Franz Müller had come over to London. He was known as quite a polite young man. He hadn't caused any problems. He wasn't a violent man.
The records we have from his friends suggest that he was always trying to improve his own clothing to get a more fashionable angle to coat or waistcoat or trousers.
He was employed as a tailor, and in the weeks before he went to America, he was actually earning about 25 shillings a week.
He had a certain amount of pretensions and would tell people that he was going over to America, where he was going to be earning £150 a year, paid for by his employers. Well, that wasn't actually true, but nevertheless, he was keen to do well, he was ambitious, and he wanted to go to America.
Müller's journey to New York was even slower than expected. The winds were against them. After more than 2 weeks at sea, the Victoria had barely escaped the coast of Ireland. The vast Atlantic still lay ahead. Müller passed the time gambling. He lost a bet over how much German sausage he could eat. He sold off his shirts to pay debts. But he betrayed no concern over what he'd left behind in London. If he feared the police were after him, the other passengers didn't notice. All Müller had to do was get to America. Once he was there, he must have thought he would be free.
The situation in America was pretty dramatic because America was in the third year of the Civil War.
There was, as a result, a considerable need for fighting men. All that Franz Muller would have needed to do to disappear was join up under whatever name came to his head.
There's every chance he could have become anonymous, melted into the crowd. It was a huge, huge, huge country, and its systems of police tracking were much more effective in the big cities than they were elsewhere. So if he'd reached those shores first, then I'm not sure he would ever have been caught and brought to justice.
As the Victoria struggled across the Atlantic, in London, Detective Inspector Richard Tanner was in a race against time. If he planned to arrest Muller in America and bring him back, Tanner would need an extradition agreement, and to get that, he needed more evidence.
He knew that to have an extradition hearing, he would have to prove the case to the satisfaction of the American authorities. And in those days, extradition proceedings were in their infancy, and they were always difficult.
It was going to be a matter of very careful preparation, very careful negotiation in order for the extradition to be granted.
So Tanner is caught in a really tense race against time because Muller is bobbing across the Atlantic Ocean very slowly in his boat, the Victoria. And Tanner's aware he's got to compile all this evidence that can present a watertight case, and he's also got to make sure that the extradition process is going to be effective at the other end.
Armed with the photograph of Muller, Inspector Tanner hurried once more to the jeweller John Death. Death confirmed it. That was definitely the man who had come into his shop to exchange the gold watch chain. Tanner rushed all over London. He spoke to Muller's landlady, his friend, his employer. He was building up a sketch of a vain and boastful young man, a young man desperate for money to cross the Atlantic. A young man who, shortly after the murder of Thomas Briggs, was seen with a fine new top hat.
The inquiries showed that Franz Muller had actually bought a ticket at London docks on the Tuesday of that week, and he'd set sail on the Thursday. But Jonathan Matthews had told the police just too late for Franz Muller to have been caught whilst he was still in London.
Suddenly the case acquired a great urgency, and the hunt for Muller began.
The witnesses were hurried to Bow Street Magistrates Court. Depositions were taken and the evidence heard. By 6 o'clock on the 19th of July, a warrant had been issued for Muller's arrest. Tanner had gathered everything he could. There was no more time. Late that evening, the exhausted inspector boarded an express train bound for Liverpool. With him were Detective Sergeant George Clark, the jeweller John Death, and the cabman Jonathan Matthews. They had tickets booked on a fast transatlantic steamer leaving the next morning.
There was no other way of contacting America. The undersea cable would be another year, 18 months before that was in position.
There was no alternative, but he had to go himself, and he had to get there before the Victoria landed.
The huge advantage that the British had was that they could use the expensive means of travelling using a steam-powered vessel rather than a sailing vessel.
Tanner arrived in New York on the 5th of August. Muller may have had a 5-day head start, but Tanner reached America first. The police inspector was relieved. There was still much for him to do.
New York City was very much unlike, our association of it with these soaring metallic skyscrapers. It was low rise in those days, and you had pigs galloping through the streets. It was still very much embryonic.
The American Civil War had been going on for 3 or 4 years at the time. Britain was accused of taking sides in favour of the South, or that was the perception in New York.
Now, there was no extradition treaty between New York State and Britain. And so the first thing that had to be done was that any arrest of Muller had to be done under American law by an officer appointed by the US Marshal.
There was a lot of controversy in New York about what was going to happen to this prisoner when he was eventually arrested in New York.
Tanner waited and waited. Colleagues from London arrived on another boat with more paperwork for the extradition, but still there was no sign of Muller. The August heat in New York was punishing. Tanner and the other Englishmen sweltered in their rooms in the Everett House Hotel on 17th Street. They waited and wondered. Had Muller's ship been lost at sea? Had it been forced into another port? Might Muller escape them after all? With each day, Tanner's worries grew until, finally, on the 24th of August, the Victoria was spotted off the coast. It had been at sea almost 6 weeks. Tanner's long, stifling wait in New York was at an end. At last, the winds were carrying his quarry into port. Franz Muller was seized by American police before his ship had even docked. He flatly denied any involvement in the murder of Thomas Briggs. He never was on that train at all, he insisted. Now, a court in New York had to decide whether Detective Inspector Tanner had the evidence to prove otherwise.
Franz Muller was arrested, taken into custody, and he appeared before Mr. Newton, who was the commissioner at New York, who had this court hearing to decide whether Franz Muller was going to be extradited and sent back in custody to Britain to face trial.
There was a tremendous amount of sympathy for Muller from the immigrant community and hostility towards Britain, so it was going to be difficult.
The advantage that Tanner had was that extradition could be granted on the grounds that there was sufficient evidence to suggest there was a case to be answered. They stuck to that. They didn't try to defend the British cause. They didn't join in the emotionalism.
Mr. Newton decided that he should go back and agreed to the extradition request. If he hadn't done so, then Franz Muller would have been free to have been released, and he could have travelled anywhere in America. The chances of him being returned to face trial for the murder of Thomas Briggs would have been very remote.
With the extradition order secured on the 3rd of September, Tanner escorted Muller onto the steamship Etna. They left New York and America behind and set out once more into the Atlantic. The murder of Thomas Briggs had become a sensation in the British press. In Liverpool, a crowd awaited Muller's arrival. In the eyes of many, the young German was already guilty.
it was difficult to see that he would actually get a fair hearing. Such was the conviction among the general public that he was actually guilty of the murder.
The British public were intensely fascinated by the case because this was the first ever railway murder, and that was quite something. And the Fleet Street behemoth, the mass media, the biggest mass media the world had ever seen, there were literally 15 different morning papers. This was elixir to them.
What is interesting is that doubts begin to creep in. The presumptions of his guilt needed to be questioned.
Despite investigators' best efforts, they found no one who could place Muller at the scene of the crime. And there were at least 5 witnesses who spoke of seeing 2 other men in the compartment with Briggs, and neither matched the description of Franz Muller. But this information was not shared with the defense. The police were then under no obligation to do so. In 1864, the deck was stacked against the accused. There was no appeals court. The defendant was barred from giving evidence, and even his counsel was not allowed to sum up the defense to the jury at the end of the trial.
There was a German legal protection society that operated not only in London but also in New York, and they were concerned that actually, as a German, he was being discriminated against and perhaps being treated unfairly.
It had the feel rather of perhaps a show trial to some extent. They just wanted to rubber stamp what the court of public opinion had already found to have been guilty.
Franz Muller's trial began at the Old Bailey on the 27th of October 1864. 12 men would decide his fate. Over the next 3 days, they heard how the crushed beaver hat found in the blooded compartment matched one belonging to Muller. They heard about the hat he had with him in New York, which was silk and cut down in the crown to alter its height. And they heard how police discovered in Muller's luggage a piece of cloth sewn into a pouch and tied in a ribbon. Inside was Thomas Briggs' missing gold watch.
I have to say, it did look bad for Muller. He looked like the perfect part, on paper at least.
All the defence counsel could do was try and attack the prosecution's witnesses. Jonathan Matthew, the hansom cab driver, he was particularly savaged by defence counsel over a 21-day sentence that he'd served for a minor theft many, many years ago. Defence counsel was really clutching at straws.
There was sort of defence witness. One of them, or at least one of them, said that they thought that Thomas Briggs had been in the compartment with 2 men on that night.
The problem is that their witness testimony did not really make the impact that retrospectively it should have done.
The jury took just 15 minutes to make their decision. Muller was guilty. The judge donned the black cap and sentenced him to death. Early on the morning of the 14th of November, 1864, a gallows was erected outside Newgate Jail. Heavy rain was falling, but that didn't put off the crowds. They gathered in their tens of thousands to watch Franz Muller die. A few minutes before 8 o'clock, with the prison bell ringing, the condemned man was led out. The crowd roared as Muller, pale and trembling, climbed the scaffold. His legs were strapped, the noose placed around his neck, and a white hood pulled down over his face. Moments before the trapdoor gaped beneath his feet, the 24-year-old spoke in an urgent whisper to the German pastor beside him. Ich habe es getan, he said. Ich habe es allein getan. Ich habe keine Mitschuldigen. I did it. I did it alone. I have no accomplice. Then the trap door opened and Müller fell. After months of denying involvement in the crime, Müller had confessed. But mysteries remained. What actually happened in the first-class compartment that summer night? Had Müller planned the robbery, or did he act on impulse? Did he mean to kill Thomas Briggs by throwing him off the train? Or did the old man fall trying to escape?
I think the murder was very much a spur-of-the-moment thing. I mean, his man in his 60s looked an affluent man, and I think Müller just saw his opportunity.
He was carrying money in his wallet. He had a silk handkerchief, as well as his silk hat. He was carrying a briefcase, which was the type that bankers used to convey bullion or valuables in. I think he must have seemed a very tempting prospect.
It may well be that he saw the chance of snatching a gold watch and making the money and getting his way to America, but perhaps didn't realise that Thomas Briggs would have perhaps resisted so much.
There was a scuffle, and he ended up sort of thwacking this poor banker over the head with his stick. And you know, these things can happen very fast.
By modern standards, I don't think what took place in that carriage would count as murder. It would be manslaughter at most. The fatal injuries to Thomas Briggs happen as a result of him falling or being pushed out of the railway carriage.
The sensational murder of Thomas Briggs did nothing to slow the advance of the railways. Engines became more powerful, passengers more numerous. But as this technological boom grew and grew, so did the opportunities for the greedy and the violent. Franz Müller has gone down in British history as the first railway murderer. He would not be the last.